my research on Indian grand narrative, I want to first explain what the term means. It's a technical term, and not just, okay, hamari kahani kya hai, that's a popular term, but there's a technical meaning also. And then I'll talk about one particular chapter, which I've never spoken about before publicly, and it's a particularly controversial chapter. So you guys pay attention. First, the general perspective. You know, after India's independence, there were five waves of studying India, 5 different drishtis, 5 different types of siddhant on studying India from the West. And I've talked about it, the 5 waves of Indology. One of them is postmodernism. Postmodernism is particularly dangerous because it seems to talk like Vasudeva Kutumbakam type of discussion. We are all one, no borders, and so on. But actually, it's the most dangerous thing that we could be hosting, and especially our English honors people and social sciences people have brought it in a big way. So I want to spend a little bit on that because the term grand narrative is something that they coined. So the West developed, you know, modernity, science, technology. That was the age of modernity. But then they were very shaken up that modernity had climaxed in 2 exceedingly horrifying things. One was Nazism. They were the most modern state. So that's the culmination of modernity in the 20th century. It horrified these intellectuals. And the second was the rise of communism, and it killed 100 million people. So people who were Marxists were looking for a different spin. Without giving up Marxism, they were looking for a different spin. And they also wanted to find out how come many countries did not have a communist revolution, although there's a big disparity between rich and poor. They just didn't have a communist revolution. So they kept coming up with different theories. Now in that manthan among the left, within the Europe and US, which got exported to India, they came up with this idea that a grand narrative, and this is their term, and that's why I'm giving a response to that term, a grand narrative is inherently abusive, inherently oppressive, because it's the result of elitists. So whether the Nazis came and built a grand narrative, whether the communists came and built a grand narrative, whoever builds a grand narrative is never something that is bottom up, it's never of the people. It is always some male narrative over female, majority over minority. So these are all grand narratives. So what they decided is that there should be something called history from below, which means the Aam Aadmi history, and that they called subaltern studies, which means study this minority's narrative, that minority's narrative, study the narratives, plural, many, many small narratives from below which are trying to challenge and topple the one grand narrative. And this is where the Breaking India comes in. Because the whole idea of this project of toppling the grand narrative is to empower small little fragments, separatist groups, create their narratives, create a narrative of, you know, Maoists, create a narrative of this tribe or this jati or this community, this particular religion, against the big narrative. Now the interesting thing is, the people who came up with this theory did not intend it for India. They intended to deconstruct the French grand narrative in Africa and give the power back to the French, and the British grand narrative in the colonies and give it back to the colonies. So the purpose of Europeans to create this grand narrative thesis that grand narratives are bad and you should replace them, that was different. But Indian leftists took this, brought it in, and started deconstructing Hinduism as the grand narrative, and started deconstructing India as the grand narrative. So in the 80s and early 90s, it was very fashionable to talk about grand narrative, and you'll see many dissertations and many books and papers when they talk about grand narrative, it's some horrible evil thing. It is oppressive, it is top down. So I decided to do exactly the opposite. That is why I picked their terminology and turn it around and give it a whole different meaning. In fact, point by point, I find flaws in their whole scholarship. So that is why I use the term grand narrative, not some random, not a term with a sort of common meaning, but a very technical meaning. During my business days, the introduction mentioned from Ganesh that I had companies in 20 countries. One of the things I always did was try to understand the grand narrative of any place I did business. Whether it's France, whether it is Korea, whether it is China, whether it is Mexico, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, all kind of places. I would always spend a certain amount of time. Indonesia, I learned a lot. I would spend a lot of time asking, who are you? How do you see yourself? What is your sense of history? What keeps you together? What are your aspirations? What is your religion? All kind of things that one would study with a sympathy. And I found that corporate leaders in these countries were very proud of their grand narrative. So it convinced me that this whole leftist, postmodernist project had failed. It had failed. Because, in France, while they're very leftist and all that, postmodernist, but every Frenchman knows what is pride of his, whatever it is, whether it is their wine, but whatever they're proud of, fashions, every country has this pride of heritage, something very extraordinary about them. So I started as part of my corporate, my entrepreneurship, I started understanding the grand narratives. And people took me seriously. So I would come back next time to Poland and tell them what else I've learned about their grand narrative. They're very impressed. They thought that nobody else, no other Indian had come and taken this matter seriously. Because the typical Indian businessman goes there, he doesn't want to hear all these kind of things. He just wants to talk about, secular, financial stuff, accounting stuff, market share, all that no culture involved. And I was very interested in understanding culture. So for example, I understood in Indonesia why they have Hindu names. They're all called Ram, Sita, their bank, and they're Muslims. Most of them are Muslims, but they have their Hindu names. Why is that so? What is the origin of that? And after numerous conversations, I got a lot of insight. And this was actually a business tool. You can relate to business people in other countries better if you understand their culture with sympathy and they realize that you are honest about it and you're not just pulling a fast one. So I don't know why the Tatas and the Infosys and these kind of people don't inculcate training about other countries' grand narratives as part of their corporate training. In fact, I have some relatives who are very senior in some of these top few Indian companies I don't want to name. And when they visit the US, they're visiting one of their subsidiaries, they're visiting some factory and all that, and they're having some argument with the local workers. It's very clear that the Indians coming from headquarters in India just don't understand the grand narrative of these people, which is not very conscious. It is unconscious in them. In their psychology, it is clear. And so there is this barrier because the Indian is talking to them without really knowing how they are thinking deep inside. And so this is this kind of a lack of appreciation. I was inspired as a child when I was reading the history of the East India Company. I was very inspired by the investment the East India Company made in understanding Indians. And we think that they did us a favor. They're translating some Sanskrit books, and Max Miller came. Max Miller didn't come, but he was translating, and these other fellows came, and what all they did, various Sanskrit scholars and anthropologists and social sciences people came. Actually, they were trying to understand who we are, to be able to manipulate, to be able to make us laugh, make us cry, make us fight. To rule over us, you need to understand. So this business of understanding the grand narrative of people became very important to me. Being based in the US for the past 47 years, which means I've lived there longer than the vast majority of Americans have, because they're younger than that, most of them. So having lived there so long and being a very keen person studying the grand narrative issue, I've written actually 2 or 3 big volumes which I have yet to publish on the American grand narrative and how it pertains to their policy towards India and what India should know about it. Now, United States has an official name for their grand narrative. This is very interesting. There's a name for it. It's called American exceptionalism. if you search American exceptionalism, you will find that since the late 1800s, this term has been used. Actually, the term started even earlier in the 1600s, before there was a USA. But in the mid-late 1800s, it became very popular. And since then, every single president, doesn't matter which party, has talked about American exceptionalism as his ideal. And you can watch Fox News, which is right-wing. You can watch MSNBC, which is left-wing. They're all proud of the American exceptionalism idea, all of them. So you got to understand, and this is taught in schools, the founding fathers, you know, what is great. American exceptionalism in a nutshell means that we, the Americans, are the world's exceptional people. We are the world's exceptional people. Now, there's many versions of it. There is the Judeo-Christian version, which says this is the Garden of Eden, as described in the Bible. There is the secular left-wing version of it, which says we have this work ethic, we have this great constitution, we are the land of R&D and science and technology, everybody wants to come here. So whatever the particular point of emphasis might be from one interpretation to the other, they all believe in the American exceptionalism. There's a name for it, and the bottom line is that we are the world's exceptional people. Now, other countries may not have a name, but it is clear that China has this. When I used to do business, Chinese leaders, I'm talking about before they became so powerful, I'm talking about early 90s, when I used to visit there a lot. Chinese leaders were inculcated from childhood, there is something grand and special about our country. Japanese, very clear, very clear. So, French, of course, British, Russians, all of these kind of places. So I started systematically looking at the issue of Indian grand narrative. I feel that at one time, Ramayana was our grand narrative. It was performed in every village. Every jati was part of it. It was a story of our story. This is our story. A grand narrative is that kind of a thing that brings us together. I remember even in my childhood in the 60s, 50s and 60s, in Delhi, we used to do Ram Leela. It took a month, you know. Everybody who had some role. We all spent time, you know, making a bow, painting this, painting that, like that. So I used to play Lakshman. That was my role. So, you know, it's like in the neighborhood, they would say, wo Lakshman, you are Lakshman, like that. So that is how you're known. So somebody is known in this way, some tough guys, Ravan, like that. So, you know, we are kids, we're having fun. There is no barrier, no boundary, and you go to villages, you'll find that Ram Leela was a collective celebration of grand narrative, unfortunately destroyed and turned from a participatory thing, you participating, to a passive viewing TV. So first it became something that the Ram Leela used to be then enacted in a very high-class way in Delhi. There was a Ram Leela. I think government did it. So instead of us doing it in our neighborhood, every 100 different neighborhoods doing their own Ram Leela, everybody would just go and watch the Ram Leela. So we became passive, but at least the performance was live. And then a few years later, it became TV. So now that's gone. So the idea is no longer that I put it in my body, I enact it, I feel a certain way, I feel a certain way towards my fellow actors in this and so on. So this is actually our grand narrative. You live your grand narrative. Grand narrative is something you embody. So when you want to interpret, whether it is Donald Trump, or whether it is his opponent, or some previous guy, or whether it is some fellow from the US or Russia or wherever who comes to India and you are negotiating, you must know their grand narrative in order to understand who it is, what is he talking about, when he's saying this, what does it mean, what's real, what's not real, how do I tell him something so I make a strong point, but I don't hit him hard where it'll really hurt him and he may come back at me. So how to negotiate, you need to know the other side. I mean, this every businessman knows, that you got to understand the other person's psychology. And to understand their psychology, you have to understand their grand narrative. It's absolutely mind-boggling that Ministry of External Affairs, ICCR, which is the Indian Council of Cultural Relations, don't have a clue about this. Because I've sat and talked to some of their people, the Nehru Center people and various people. Nor do I think that Culture Ministry, nor do I think our HRD or any of those really understand this idea of grand narrative, be it somebody else's or be it our own. So this is a pretty serious state of affairs. So grand narrative is a much bigger, broader, deeper subject than just writing, what is our history and how great we are as a nation. There's a lot more to it. Now this book has 3 parts. The book I'm writing, called The Indian Grand Narrative. Part 1 is the early history of the grand narrative and what the narrative was and how it evolved. There are versions of it, how it evolved, and the evidence for it. Part 2 is the disruption, how it got disrupted. We have the Islamic invasion, we have the European, we also have the post-independence 5 waves of Indology, a very, very destructive enterprise over the last 70 years, very, very destructive to our grand narrative. Now, many people, when they talk about colonialism, they limit themselves to British. Actually, there is an Islamic colonialism, and this is a controversial point. I mean, my fellow Indians don't like this. I'd say Islam was a colonial system. They don't like it. I'm not anti-Islam, by the way. My controversial point, which I'll come to, is actually to tell you that what my view is of Islam, and it's not an anti-Islam thing. They're Islamic invaders. And a Muslim should disown them and say that just because he's my religion doesn't mean he's good. I mean, Dr. Swamy doesn't say that because some corrupt fellow, is a Hindu or something and maybe he's doing puja and all that, therefore we give him a free pass. I mean, if he's a crook, he's a crook. And so we have to do that. So the second part is the disruptive. And the third part is the most important one, which is the future. So there is a disruption and there is a construction. What is the constructive aspect? How do we construct a grand narrative? Which is scientific for today, which accepts the reality. We have minorities, that's a reality. We have problems, all sorts of problems, that's a reality. We have, so you have to be very realistic in evaluating the circumstances we are in. And then you can propose, construct, discuss what the solution is to that. Now, the research that I've been doing is not a description of this invasion happened, this fight happened, this is the history. It goes into deep structures. There are deep structures of our civilization. There are deep, frameworks starting with the Vedas and so on, very deep frameworks. There is the role of Sanskrit. There is a role of Siddhant. There is so many things. These keep assimilating, more and more changes. The Smritis keep change. The Shrutis are the same. The Smritis change. So when you want to study the grand narrative, it is not frozen in time. It is not like, ye kahani hamesha ki aisi thi. It has changed. At the same time, you can't say that, okay, it's a new country, a new narrative totally. So how do you reconcile something is the same and something is also different? So one way I propose is that we have been reincarnated. That's our idea. So Bharat has been reincarnated into modern India. And Sanatana Dharma got reincarnated into modern Hinduism. So it is both modern and it is also continuous, a continuity of an old Atma. Old Atma. Deen Dayal Upadhyay called it Chitti, that every nation has a Chitti. And the body can go, new one comes, but there is a Chitti we should understand, and we should build a whole society around that Chitti. And I've lectured many times that, unfortunately, the Deen Dayal Upadhyay died very early, as you know, and his project was nobody continued it. You see, this is a part of a kind of a laziness we have. We feel कि किसी और ने कर दिया, so I don't have to do anything. A lot of people ask me, why are you doing this, so-and-so, Vivekananda already wrote this, or Aurobindo already wrote it. The point is, the opponents are on the move. The disruptive forces are always doing something new. You cannot say कि तेंदुलकर ने century लगा दी थी, तो अभी हमको कुछ करने की जरूरत नहीं है. The point is you have to do your work. What was done at that time was good at that time. But you see, even in Deen Dayal Upadhyay's time, Marxism existed. Post-colonial studies which Edward Said developed was after Deen Dayal Upadhyay. That was another wave. Then leading to subaltern studies, then leading to postmodernism studies. Now there is something new called Neo-Orientalism. So they've come up with these fancy terms, and these are, it's like if somebody wants to study Vedanta, you can't just study Adi Shankara, you have to study all the future, all the subsequent developments. You can't just study and say, okay, uska jawab de diya to theek ho gaya, because you have to study all the nuances, all the variations, all the subsequent challenges and answers and all that. So same way, when we have intellectuals who got to respond to the international bombardment that we face, the disruption that we faced, it is not enough to say Vivekananda gave an answer because he gave it for his time, Sri Aurobindo gave it for his time, Deen Dayal Upadhyaya gave it for his time, and these people actually, one over the other, evolved. They all had something different and new to say. So now in the 21st century, where are the Deen Dayal Upadhyayas? We need to do this new thinking. So this is something we haven't, it's difficult to come across, and it's not just a few speeches here and there, it's serious work, serious hard work that we have to do. So that's what I'm trying to do, and that is what I will summarize in this book called The Indian Grand Narrative. Now I will turn to the controversial chapter I want to talk about. I have a certain amount of minutes left, and I want to focus on this one chapter. It'll be one of maybe a dozen chapters altogether. The chapter deals with what is the place for Indian Muslims in our grand narrative? And you can see this is a very hot topic. You know, dhyan se bolna pe, huh? Right. So I started conducting some interviews in Delhi with Muslims, young, broad-minded, educated Muslims. And many of them are involved in this triple talaq, you know, fighting triple talaq and all this polygamy and things like that. And I started asking them questions about everything controversial even. And I have videotapes them. I put them on videotape. I'm going to edit, put them out on public, and they're willing. So I found, to my surprise, there are substantial number of Muslims who've had it with Orthodox Islam and who feel that the vast majority of Indian Muslims are not well-educated people, and they are therefore driven by whatever the Imam says. And the Imam is looking for his own power structure. And these more educated, professional type Muslims don't like it. They have fear, some of them, and there is kind of not necessarily an organized approach. So there is also a leadership issue. They need some encouragement. They need some organizational help. So I figured this is a fruitful enterprise, fruitful area of my investigation as part of my grand narrative. Because imagine if I wrote a book called The Indian Grand Narrative and there's nothing about Muslims, except that they've destroyed some things, you know, 1,000 years ago they destroyed, which they did, and my book is very clear, very strong on all the Muslim destruction. But the question still remains, what about today? What do we do today? So I don't accept the voice, the Muslim voice which says reject Islam, so the Tariq Fateh type. Because if you reject Islam, maybe a few people will go along with that, but the majority of Muslims are not going to just say, okay, we reject Islam. And the ghar wapsi is going to be fine for some people. I think it's not a practical idea that you will do ghar wapsi of the whole lot of such people. I don't think that's going to work. So these are fine, they're okay. I mean, there should be internal criticism in every religion. So some people are anti-Islam from within, that's fine, that's their choice. And some people may want to do ghar wapsi, that's also their choice. But I wanted to find out, is there a narrative where the person is a proud Muslim, but he's, before that, first and foremost, he's a proud Bharatiya. And I wanted to investigate that. So I have a name for it. And I have a domain names also. And there's going to be a chapter with that name. And this is, I'm calling such people Swadeshi Muslims. That's my term. Now people ask, why not Indian? And I said, because, you know, when you say Indian, तो बहस पड़ती है, was India 70 years old? Did British make it? Was it Hindustan? So, you know, I don't want a diversion. People like to divert, and our people then go into arguing that. Swadeshi Muslims has no kind of ambiguity in what it means. Swadesh, this is my desh. So if I were to say, are you an Indian Muslim proud? He'll say, yeah, yeah, yeah. But when you go deep into it, he's only talking in a certain camouflaged way. He's not really what I'm looking for. But when I say, is this your Swadesh? Matri Bhumi, Pitri Bhumi. This is it. Which means, and I define very clearly, that your ancestors are from here. They didn't come from the Middle East. So when we talk about decolonizing, getting rid of the British influence, then also decolonizing, de-Arabizing is something you ought to do, because Islam, if you claim Islam is a universal faith that Allah has brought to everybody in the world, then Arab customs, dress, names, habits are not necessarily going to supersede the Indian customs and culture. You can still be a Muslim. So I challenge this, and I have this on videotape, and when I go back to Delhi tonight, Tuesday, I have another meeting with this group. So every time I'm telling them, go bring a few more friends, and we'll see how far it'll go. But I think it will become an interesting movement. So I've even said things like, the Swadeshi Muslim, it has to claim our heroes, the heroes of the soil, rather than the invaders as the heroes. So maybe the invaders were of your religion, and your ancestors were natives, Swadeshis, who lost, and you became, you now adopt the religion of the invaders. And I'm not asking you to convert. I'm not asking you to do any of that. You can remain that. But can you be a Muslim without being Arabized or Persianized or Turkish? Can you be a Bharatiya-style Muslim? And this is a very interesting thing. I tell them that my experience in Indonesia has been very helpful, because in Indonesia, they say their language is Bhasha. They write in the English alphabet, but they're writing Bhasha. And when I ask them, who are you? We're Muslims, so what is this Bhasha thing? And so they're saying that our ancestors came from India. They're saying that our civilization came from India. Actually, this is it started as I'll give you an anecdote, just to divert a little bit. I was leasing office premises for my company. So this Indonesian general manager, very good friend of mine, very soft-spoken, Muslim, but he's one of the philosophers that I would talk to at night, you know, and then he would introduce me to college professors of history and so on to teach me about their history, their grand narrative. So he took me to this negotiation, and the landlady was a Chinese. So he says, you talk because you're American and she'll take you more seriously than taking me. So I said, why? It's your country. So he said, but in our country, we have an inferiority complex. We think Chinese are superior. He told me that. And then he said, but we think that the Indians are even more superior to the Chinese. This is what he told me. So it's very interesting. So I learned a lot about, you know, their idea. And then he's the one who said, if you really want these appointments with the telecom minister, this one, bring an American blonde lady, they'll all give appointments. So I learned this cultural thing, you know. Actually, it worked. I then took this, I had a secretary. So I told her, we give you cards saying vice president, all that. You sit there next to me, I'll do the talking and all, just sit, smile and all that. Don't say anything. So we brought her to, in India also it works. In India, before all these phone companies, we had something called MTNL. MTNL and VSNL was the international carrier. Monopoly, only VSNL calls. And MTNL was domestic. So to do this venture that we were doing, we had to do business with these people. So I remember she was so successful in getting meetings with these people. They would all say, they would be like ignoring me and talking to her, but I'm the boss actually, I own the company. And she's a secretary that we've glorified, ताकि people will take her seriously. So they're all into, Diane ji ko coconut water la do. And Diane wanted nothing to do with any coconut water. But they were really into pampering her, that she's this person, this white lady, blonde. So it got into her head. So then, when they would ask to negotiate the contract, the deal, whatever I was presenting, they would start talking to her. And she got into her head that, wait, I'm powerful. So she started talking to them, and I'm left out. So one day, I gave her a warning. I said, in front of them, it looks you are VP and I'm the president and all that, but they may be wanting to talk to you, but do not outsmart my terms of agreement, because my company, you can't negotiate. But she got into so much power, because they started inviting her and all that she would try to cut her own deal. So I fired her. Then I was very concerned that I need a solution. So someone told me, you go and hire an actor. Because actors know that this script hai, script bolna hai. So I put an ad at the Rutgers University, which is in Princeton, big university. They have a theater department. I went and put an ad saying, we'll pay the expenses. You'll perform the role of an American corporate executive. You'll go to a foreign country. You live in a 5-star. You'll get first class flying back here. And you have to perform this role. So then I auditioned some people, hired somebody, and said, first thing I said is, it's not your deal. The producer and director is telling you what you have to say. And you just say it. And so anyway, that was a very big success. But back to the Indonesia story, I learned a lot about Muslims who have not become Ashrafized. Ashraf means those Muslims who feel our ancestors were Arab or Iranian or Turk. It's like Anglo-Indians started thinking that we are Angrez. And for a while, when I was a kid, every Christian used to think that my grandmother, 1/8 or something was English and all. Everybody wanted to have some little trace of British blood to kind of legitimize and say, I'm a little superior to you. And today you find that among the Goans. You go to Goa, there are a lot of people who want to say I'm Portuguese and all that. I know some Goan friends who don't like it. They're Goan Christians who don't like it. But there is this sense of superiority over, some foreign DNA. So Muslims have this problem, Ashraf. And when they tell you that aapka caste system hai, we don't have a caste system, you can talk right back and say you have Ashraf, Ajlaf, and Azlaf. These are Muslim castes in India. They don't marry with each other. They consider themselves to be separate qaum, and so on. And this is a very serious problem in Pakistan. The ones who are from Bihar are considered lower caste and so forth. So if you really do the DNA test of Indian Muslims, you will find that actually most of them are Swadeshis, they don't know it. But so we would just sort of re-educate them that this is who you are. There's also a scientific way. It's a very, very tiny fraction of the DNA component of the Muslim population that would be like Arabs. So I tell them, so back to my research, I started telling them that, Arabs are not as civilized as we are. You should be proud of our heritage. You can be religion is different from being an Arab race and an Arab culture. It is different. And so there are certain practices that enter a religion because it's in the culture around. Like maybe talaq or maybe multiple wives and all these kind of things, but they are not really part of the original religion. There is a certain context. I wish they had separated Smriti from Shruti. I wish they had done that, then we could argue very clearly that aapki Shruti mein ye nahi hai, this is in your Smriti, you can change it. And why do you want to bring Arab Smriti here? You can bring the Shruti, which is universal, but the Smriti has to be localized and updated. And that way they could be modern, technological, scientific, they could be, Swadeshi Muslims. Absolutely, because they have to accept that their origin is Swadeshi, and their heroes are Swadeshi. Their sacred land and sacred sites are here. So when you talk about decolonizing, and there are all these conferences, conclaves, aajkal, there's almost one conclave every day or every 2-3 conclaves a week at least going on all over India. Manthan, conclave, this and that, Lit Fest going on. And decolonizing is a very common, fashionable theme. But you know, they're decolonizing from the Europeans. They're afraid to talk about decolonizing from the Muslims. And one of the things I demand as a criteria for being a proper Swadeshi Muslim is that you should accept that we ought to decolonize the Muslim population from the Arab identity. And this Ashraf business, we should be proud to be who we are. And we can be very proud to be Muslims. So I'm working with these experts. Some imams have entered this group, some lawyers have entered. We'll see where it goes. But I'm experimenting with this idea that can there be a total conformity to Islam, which is not hostile to this sacred nation and to the Hindus, and which is not more loyal to the West Asia type of cultures. The Arabs who were the place where Islam originated, and Jerusalem, where, you know, various places in Israel where first Judaism originated, and then Christianity originated, and then in the same general region, Islam originated. These are desert religions. They're desert religions. We are a forest civilization. Green, forest, waters, fertile, plenty. We're not hungry for food because nothing grows, you see. So the desert tribes have a different kind of ethos, and it's not a desirable thing that every Indian Muslim has to copycat the desert type of lifestyle. So this is as I told you, it's a controversial. It's going to be risky, and I'm willing to take that risk. But I think that if we can create a core group, even small, who say we are Swadeshi Muslims, it will be the beginning of quite a big, it will be a tipping point, and it can have a ripple effect. And I would like to put that as my take on Islam or Muslims in my Indian grand narrative. That's what I mean. You see, if we don't do that, the Breaking India forces are all controlled from elsewhere. So you want to snap that link from elsewhere. Whether it is Saudi money coming, I mean, there's nothing wrong, have madrasas, have universities, fine. But why are Saudis dictating who will be the appointed, the faculty and what the curriculum will say? Why is the ultimate adhikari of knowledge sitting there when you have your Quran, you can interpret it? And so, and then similarly with Western Christian, I see every minority group mischaracterized as a minority. Or let me put it this way, those minority groups that have a foreign nexus, that are a footprint, local footprint of an international powerhouse, are mischaracterized as a minority. Actually, it's a branch office of a powerful majority. Because if you had a small office of IBM where there's 100 people, you wouldn't say, well, 100 and to choti si venture, it must be minority. And if you see McDonald's with 20 employees, you're not going to say it's a minority, well, let's give them minority status. So similarly, if you have a church or a madrasa with a small number of people, I mean, the point is that they are controlled, they are appointed, they are funded, they're trained by a global headquarters. They're more like an MNC. And if you look at the rules governing the Vatican, the Catholic Church, the Vatican appoints, please note this, the Vatican appoints every bishop in India. So if a foreign headquarters is appointing who the manager will be in every branch, they control the funding, they certainly control the ideology, they send them there for training. How can you say this is not a foreign enterprise? It is an MNC. And the Vatican is also a sovereign state. It is a member of the United Nations. So they're a sovereign state. So when a sovereign state appoints somebody to represent them, it's a consulate. So rather than saying that they are a minority and get special privileges, they are actually a foreign consulate. Every church is a foreign consulate. I mean, it may sound politically incorrect, but the fact is that hiding under the garb of religion and religious freedom and religions ko kuch keh nahi sakte, point is that under the garb of religion, it is a sovereign state which is running this operation, this whole franchise of local establishments. This is something we ought to discuss. we ought to be able to have free conversations and maybe litigation also, or maybe let the courts intervene and say, China has a good precedence. China decided that there's no bar on Christianity, but there's a bar on foreign church intervening. So they do not accept foreign appointed bishops. They demand that the Chinese have to organize. You can read the Bible, you can worship Jesus, no problem. But why you need somebody sitting somewhere else to appoint you? So this is a very powerful argument that our people need to take forward. The Muslims who I'm formulating right now, and if those of you are interested in joining, can email me and we can include you in the discussion. But I'm formulating, with the help of Swadeshi Muslims, a few of them, a charter, which is written by them. I'm not saying this is what it is. I'm suggesting ideas. And so far they've accepted that, cow slaughter is not a required part of Islam. Not a required part of Islam. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom, which puts out a report every year and accuses India of human rights violations and all that, in their latest report, one of the big arguments they put up is that this cow slaughter is a violation of Islamic rights. So I went there, they invited me because I always keep criticizing them. They invited me to Washington, D.C. to have a discussion with them. And I found out that the young man in charge of writing and tracking human rights violations of India is a Pakistani scholar. I have his card. He's very proud. He got a PhD from American University on South Asian Studies, religious freedom issues. So he's become an expert. Very smart of the Pakistani. कि अपने young को निकालो उसमें, and then put him in all these jobs. So he's giving me all this stuff, and I'm sitting there with all the white people, the Jewish Christian people, the commissioners, and all the people, other people, and I'm saying this guy doesn't know. In Islam, you see, cow does not exist in the desert. Cow is a tropical animal. It is not a desert animal. And the Arabs eat goat and camel. They don't eat cow. The cow just now it's a luxury item. Some sheikhs might eat it and all. But for 1,000 years, since the beginning, the more 1,400 years or whatever, the Arabs have not been beef eaters. So why you say it's a requirement? It is not a requirement. It's just they've adopted it. And in fact, if you look at Dharampal's research, Dharampal showed that cow slaughter is something the British popularized on a big scale. It existed on a small scale. It was not like a massive industry of millions and millions of cows like we're having today. That industrialization of cow slaughter happened starting in the British, and after independence, it became even bigger. So this is not something that started in Saudi Arabia or any of that stuff. So this is something that when I mentioned these facts, the Swadeshi Muslims that I'm working with accepted and said, yes, we think cow slaughter should be stopped, because why do we want to hurt our Hindu friends? That's the kind of mentality I'm looking for. Another controversial thing I have asked them is Ram Temple. I've said that in Islam, there are holy sites but no sacred sites. Sacred means this stone is not just stone, this is the divine, present. This is divine presence. I'm talking to the divine, hi, hello, now I'm having a conversation with the divine. The protocol is the Agama, giving me protocol, and I'm having this conversation. You consider it blasphemy if somebody says that inside the mosque is where Allah is. Allah is not in the mosque. They know that. So what is a mosque? A mosque is a community center. A mosque is only a community center. It's a convention center, community center where Muslims can go to one place and feel that, okay, from together we can just pray to Allah. It is from where you are praying to Allah, a very arbitrary place. There is no reference on what kind of place it has to be, what it can't be. It can be anywhere. You can pray from your house. You can pray on the street. You can pray in a mosque. You can pray anywhere you want. You can pray in an airport. There is no requirement. There is nothing comparable to Pran Pratishtha in Islam, which would make a particular mosque a sacred place. So this is why, if you ever tell a Muslim that I love your sacred mosque, if he's a knowledgeable fellow, he'll not agree with it because it is considered idolatry. he'll say it's not a sacred place. Matter is not sacred. There is no sacred river, sacred tree or mountain or building. There is no form. There is no, Allah is not in form. So we have the divine taking form. So Allah is not in form, and therefore you can't consider the mosque at all to be a sacred place. So if we tell him that, and the fact that I have so many examples of Saudi Arabia and all the different Muslim countries demolishing, moving, relocating mosques from here to there is absolutely no reason. See, the burden of proof should not be on us that this is the birthplace of Ram. The burden of proof is that we have been worshipping here for a long time for whatever reason. It is our house of worship. And the fact that we did Pran Pratishtha makes it a sacred place. And the fact that the Babri Masjid, there is nothing equivalent to Pran Pratishtha, means it can be moved. That is the argument. It has nothing to do with whether Ram was born there or not. I happen to believe he was. So there's no point in taking a higher burden of proof than necessary. So this is why Swami's argument is very brilliant. He says he has a right to worship there. He has a right to worship there. And it has nothing to do with all the other arguments. He says, I have a right to worship because the deity of Ram had Pran Pratishtha was here, that we can establish, and I as a Hindu have a right to worship that deity. That's it. So why create a higher hurdle for us to have to jump over? So we can just say this: the difference between Pran Pratishtha of a Murti and no such equivalent in a mosque is a decisive argument. That when you move the mosque, you are not violating anything. When you destroy a Murti, you are. So when I say it like this to my small group of Swadeshi Muslims, they actually like it. They're saying, you know, we should actually help our Hindus to create the temple. That's what some of them said. So and then I've talked about 370. They feel there is no reason why it should be separate from the rest of India. I've talked to them about Uniform Civil Code, and they've said, you know, we should be treated like the rest of, especially I'll tell you, we should start with educated, professional young women. They're very fed up of this whole imam-dominated, male-dominated kind of interpretation. They would like to get out of it. And we can help them. We can give it. Rather than saying, I'm going to knock out Islam, I'm against Islam, Islam is wrong, because that is not going to attract a whole lot of people. And rather than saying, okay, you convert and become Hindu again, if you just say, they were very relieved when I said to them, I want to respect you as Muslim, but it has to be mutual. You respect me as Hindu. I respect Islam and the core tenets of Islam. I'm not at all against any of them. I think that this Arabization and this politicization and this vote banking and all these kind of things that have happened over time are the ones that you have to decolonize from. When I say it like that, they are very interested in joining us because, believe me, they're also looking for a way out. They feel that they're also stuck in this very, very old, closed-minded interpretation, which is not going to work in the modern world. It is not going to work. So this is my Swadeshi Muslims initiation, my Muslims movement. Now, I have a whole lot, which maybe we can take it in the Q&A. But I have a diagram in my book, which is a game board. So there is the existing game, and then there is another diagram, which is how I want to change the game. So the existing game is this, the Muslims are at the center, and they have all these forces, these Arabs funding, Arabs, Iranians sending funding. Some of that is through the agents. They've trained imams to think a certain way. There is this whole Urduization, which is also a problem, I feel, because nothing requires that in Islam that you have to Urduize. You could be in Malayalam, Bengali. The whole reason East Pakistan was split off and became Bangladesh is because Sheikh Mujibur Rahman won the election on the basis that he wanted Bengali and not Urdu, which the Pakistanis were not willing to give. So he won the election and they separated. So there is nothing in Islam that says you got to Urduize or Arabize. So all these are sort of identity engineering gimmicks that give political clout and create Breaking India forces. So I'm against that. I'm not against Islam at all. So when the game board, present game board shows Muslims with all these forces, left wing manipulating them, political people bringing them this way, that way to promise them. You know, they are against modernity. There's a tension with modernity. So the Muslim is sitting inside with all these tensions. He's got so many tensions. And he's not able to play the game, make his moves, and win. So the new game board, all these middlemen and forces are out. The Swadeshi Muslim and Hindus, so let's start with Hindus first, and then we can bring in other faiths, are in direct conversation, direct dialogue to find an equilibrium which is mutually respectful. So mutual respect as a principle for equilibrium is what I'm trying to achieve, and I want them to just ignore all these other forces that have been controlling them and talking on their behalf. Equilibriums are related to grand narrative. There are equilibriums in nature. So for instance, you have an ecosystem, you have a water cycle, you know, there's an equilibrium of the solar system, there's an equilibrium inside the body. Ayurveda tells you when the equilibrium is disrupted, it's the first stage of disease, you know, then something is going to accumulate and blockage and whatnot. There are 4 stages of disease. The first is that some equilibrium is a little bit disrupted. So there are many kinds of equilibriums. There is social equilibrium. The Varna system had a kind of a cyclical equilibrium among the different social capital. That got disrupted. So that has now become a problem. So what I told them is that if there is a healthy dynamic equilibrium between Swadeshi Muslims and Hindus, this will strengthen the Indian grand narrative, because the grand narrative will become a stable equilibrium. We currently have an unstable, tentative, volatile equilibrium. We do have it, but it is always ready to, you know, there's so many centrifugal forces. We're always on the brink of something or other happening, and we're spending a very large percentage of our GDP on internal equilibrium, just maintaining the internal, unity. So much hard power has to go. So if we could crack this soft power problem of the Muslim mind, psychology, and create a wave of Swadeshi Muslims, even if it starts with very few, but then we let them go and expand as more get educated and get into science and get into professions. I would see that the Swadeshi Muslim, clout and power and importance will increase. So I'll conclude by saying that I'm going to create a small group of Swadeshi Muslims, give them empowerment, tell them you define, I've put all this stuff out, now you define how you want it, and we can sponsor regular seminars on Swadeshi Muslims run by them, and promote them, and encourage them to run this website. So it is not going to be me doing it, but encourage them to do it. Once this is launched and in their hands and operating, I also intend to create a Swadeshi Christians, another one. So I will conclude because I've taken a lot of time, and thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.